in terms of what you can see prospectively. But a bit of strength, as long as the economy was expanding in the 1960s and 1970s, turned into weakness for workers and their unions tied to the fate of particular firms when the Japanese economy entered the lost decade of the 1990s. So it is clear, or hopefully it's clear, that I've been clear, that dualism both reflected and shaped the contours of precarious employment in Japan from its very sort of construction. So let's go to. I want to show you the dualism first. For those of you that don't know Japan, just give you a few statistics to show you that Japan still does have, a relatively high rate of unpaid family workers and cultural workers, more so than most of the other mature welfare states and capitalisms. We also see the sort of bifurcation, the dualism in terms of gender, women's labor force participation, although they're becoming more like men in their unemployment rate, although it's certainly an underestimation of that. Interestingly is the fact that usually university education increases female labor force participation, and when I say usually, if you look at the European cases or you look at the U.S. And this is a representation of that M curve of women, working, dropping out, coming back, and then leaving the labor force altogether. And you can see that the sort of M part is sort of smoothing out, but still you have that is very pronounced. I also wanted to show, and I have that. If you look at, and Korea's in the parentheses, that for young women, or women who are new entrants into the labor market, their permanent employment is lower than it is when they're at the prime ages, but it's higher than countries like France, Sweden, and Germany, and where it's that prime working age, where you see that high percentage of women who are in non-permanent employment. Go back to pastoral. Now we're in Ueno Park in Japan. I'll present some more statistics to show the kind of sort of dualism in terms of part-time and temporary employment. I just want to step back and talk just very quickly about day laborers. I said I wasn't going to talk about, but I want to tell you why I'm not going to talk about that. Although you can see in here, these are homeless and day laborers in a central park in Tokyo. Day laborers are an important group, but they precede capitalism. They predate capitalism. In fact, in some cases, they were the majority of the labor force in Japan. So talking about them, it's really a very different kind of history and different trajectory. I think I wanted to partition them out for that reason. Secondly, according to the statistics, they're a small and dwindling group. Though, and this is what is really fascinating, they've become more visible. And so this seems like you can really see it, but when you're in the park, you're just sort of glimpsing sort of bodies moving and these blue tarps. And so it's both visible and not visible. You don't see, like in a European city or certainly in the United States, homeless people and day laborers are so visible. You see them. They also live in certain districts within Tokyo and Osaka, near the red light district in Tokyo. So you can, find, the concentration, but it's, very sort of localized. Secondly, their composition is quite different from the other two types of non-standard employment. Day laborers tend to be single. Some of them are single by the fact they've never been married. Others are single because they're detached from their families. Most of them come from rural areas. They come to the city to find work. They tend to be older. ages 45 to 65. They tend to be of working class origins, as well as they have less education overall. So it's an interesting, and as I say, Tom Gill does a really wonderful job. If you're interested in the construction of masculinity by this group, Tom Gill's your man, and he's the one to look at. But I want to just partition them out for now. We could talk about them. So part-time, my argument is that part-time employment already existed in the 1960s, and you see the real change is in the early 1970s, and that's where you get the blip. And that's, I'm sorry for all of the, blank spots. I wanted to put all the data, in the paper you can read the numbers, but I wanted to put it all in one table so you could see it visually. And you can, well, I don't have data for temp employment. It's illegal up until 1985, so there aren't any statistics that's reliable on temporary employment until after the regulation. But you can see that it's already, it's a small percentage, but it doubles in that decade during the first oil shock, and you can see the gendered pattern. So you have, it's growing over time, and it's very, very dominated by women and gender in that way. This gives you the sort of age breakdown of part-time workers, male, female, and as well as wage gap, job tenure. It's, in fact, for part-timers, it's a very high job tenure for many of them, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. This is, if you are interested, I can go back to my comparative statistics in other countries. Okay. Let's just go back to our scene of Winter Park. So my argument is that part-time and temporary employment have existed prior to the burst of the bubble, already existing, but that the patterning of temporary and part-time employment is really quite different, and there are different reasons for that. Temporary work is concentrated among younger women who are single, living with their family, and often younger women prefer, those are the jobs they can have, but the jobs that they can have, and often it pays a higher wage rate, but they don't have any of the benefits. But there's an assumption that they're living at home, and many of them are living at home, so that social reproduction sort of underwrites and subsidizes these young workers. So they tend to be in their, before they get married, they tend to be younger. For part-time workers, it's women who are mothers with children. Usually their children are a little bit older. I want to turn to regulation and how the patterning is in part a result of regulation by the state, that the state helped to shape the gendered patterning and the contours of precarious employment. As I said when I showed you the statistics, up until 1985, temporary employment, or agency temporary employment in particular, was illegal, and yet it flourished sort of underground. But the state then, in 1985, made it legal, and this is initially for just 16 job categories. And these job categories were, in fact, very gender-typed, or female-typed. Stenographers, translators, filers, clerical workers, very much the traditional industry and occupation in which temporary agency, the temporary agency industry sort of got its foothold and its niche within the labor market. And then that was expanded, so it was the regulation that pretty much dictated, in fact it did, said it's only in these occupations that it's legal to hire, And so they dictated where it was going to be. They expanded it to more new media. So these are new industries. It wasn't the old Fordist production. In fact, it protected manufacturing. Manufacturing was the last to go, as was the medical establishment. The two areas that are protected by unions or associations in the medical profession. It wasn't until 2004 that it selected deregulation. Deregulation with re-regulation. What I mean by that is that for these people, as they, first, they said negative list, for those that were just being deregulated, they had, they limited the contract to 1 year. So you couldn't have multiple, or sequential contracts, which is what a lot of temporary workers have. When everything got deregulated, the deregulation, again, was not only selective, but it was very targeted in the sense that for those two areas that have some unions, and remember, unions are on these commissions. They have very low power, but they were able to, they couldn't stop neoliberal onslaught, but they could sort of slow it down. They could sort of keep some aspect of the regulation in place for those protected areas. And so in this case, the law says, and we know the law is one thing and enforcement is another, but the law says that in these areas that now have been deregulated, that after the year contract, they're supposed to be converted into permanent positions. So that's a pretty nice, situation, one in which the rest of the temporary agency workers do not have. And just so that you know, the law that was passed and then amended over this period of time had a very special name. It's called the Dispatcher Workers Law. They used dispatcher. They created their own term, one that didn't exist before in the Japanese language, haken. And they did it very deliberately because it's a temporary work that has a negative connotation. Yeah, it does. This is precarious, and therefore they created its own word. It wasn't in the same language of part-time employment. It wasn't in the same language of arubaito and part-time, but it had its own sort of. So to try to sort of linguistically sort of create this category of workers, that was illegal up until that point.
That was 1985.
That was in 1985, yeah. That was the initial law. So that was the attempt to get people into those slots where they needed them, particularly in places like Tokyo, where I did my research.
So dispatched workers to do.
Yes, dispatched. And this, I love linguistically. I know that, I don't know the language very well at all, but when you do, it's just really the loan words and which words are loaned and which are borrowed and which are not. It's very, very interesting. There's, the linguists and the anthropologists can help us with that. Age to temporary employment, there's no equal opportunity, there's no equal pay to regular work. So there was no attempt. At the same year, this is the same year that the Equal Employment Opportunity Act was passed. The same year. And so here you have this kind of patchwork. So symbolically, equal employment was important. However, and this is where let's go to part-time employment. Part-time employment isn't regulated at all until 1993. That's the first regulation, and then you get some, amendments and revisions. Part-time employment, there's no equal treatment between full and part-time work. There's no right to change from full-time to part-time work, which you can do in some countries like Sweden. And in fact, it was created to be, it has none of the benefits of a full-time job. And in Japan in particular, the law allows for, it defines part-time work in a very peculiar, or I say linguistically challenging way. It's possible to be a full-time part-timer. A full-time part-timer, tending to be mostly women, is because part-time is defined not by a threshold of hours worked like they do in the OECD, so you have to be very careful about doing any kind of comparative research. It's defined by the hours of work in your establishment. So if the hours of work, and the norm is 42 hours, 48 hours, then if you work 40 hours, which is a full-time part-timer, you are considered legally, in terms of your benefits and your access to entitlements, part-time.